thank you all for coming this evening.
Thank you.
I'm assuming the microphone works. My name is Ellie Gold. I'm the president of the Harbor League. This evening we have a fantastic panel to talk about Iran and how it affects us directly here in the United States. Many times and very often people focus on taxes, focus on balancing the budget, focus on even gas prices, but they really don't focus on the bigger picture. Yes, we understand that there's an issue with Iran, but how does it affect me? Other than it's possible that there will be a nuclear bomb dropped somewhere on the East Coast, but other than that little thing, how does it really affect us directly? How does it affect me here in Baltimore? I understand that there's an issue with Iran, Israel. There's this march on Jerusalem that's going to take place tomorrow, where Iran is encouraging people to march to Jerusalem, and, along with other organizations and other countries as well. But how does it affect me here in Baltimore? So I'm really excited about this panel, but let's take a step back for a second. And there are many new faces here this evening with us, and I want to talk about what the Harbor League is, why you're sitting here, and why we're hosting this panel. We all know that this afternoon, today the House passed the Paul Ryan's budget, which is a good thing. Of course, it probably died somewhere as it was crossing the street, but it's a good thing. I think what we have to realize and we have to focus on as well is taking a look at policy. 2 weeks ago, we had Paul Teller from the Republican Study Committee, which is a group of 165 purported conservative members of Congress. He spoke about the RSC's budget amongst Paul Ryan's budget and the Democrats' lack of budget, but just focusing on the issues, on the policy itself, and what we can do about that. But the Harbor League is different than many other organizations. It's not a Republican club, it's not a conservative club, it's a policy organization. It's an organization that gets us to understand what the policies are and how they affect us. If we can't understand how the policies affect us, how does what's going on in Iran affect us here? How does then we can't passing all the budgets in the world. If we don't understand the national security and foreign policy aspect that's going on and how it affects us, all the budgets in the world won't make a difference. I was talking with a friend of mine, Tevi Troy, who many of you have met at the Harbor League's holiday party, who's a fellow at the Hudson Institute, as well as he was the deputy secretary of Health and Human Services in the Bush administration. And he said that he told me that there were a number of studies that mentioned that of all the places for there to be some sort of terrorist attack, whether it's a bioterrorism, and that's what he was referring to, any other, Baltimore actually is probably a prime location. Because of its proximity, because it's a metropolitan center, although it's a smaller one, its proximity to Washington D.C., it's somewhere near Philadelphia. It's on the same side of the country as New York. This is a perfect place to have such an attack. That's the reason why we have this policy discussion to talk about how it affects us here in Baltimore. How does it affect me, Ellie Gold, as I drive to work? So that's what the Harbor League is about. I guess we do care how one votes, but it's a free country. Vote how you wish. But understand why you're voting. And the Harbor League hosts events, whether it's Paul Teller about the budgets, whether it's Herb London and Jim Woolsey and Ken Timmerman about Iran and how it affects us. I encourage everybody to, if you haven't done so already, I know we're having trouble with the online payments, I'm told, but please take a look at theharborleague.org and learn more about us. I think, if I'm not mistaken, there were membership forms passed around, and please take a look at that as well, and consider becoming a member. Moving on to why you're here tonight. This evening we have our panel, as I discussed before, and moderating the panel is Herb London. Herb London is the President Emeritus of the Hudson Institute. He is a noted social critic whose work has been written in numerous publications. His daughter is Stacey London from What Not to Wear, for those of you who watch TLC. And Herb has, well, let's put it this way. In 2000, just to give you an idea of who Herb is and what the caliber of our panel is, and this is just the moderator. The Harbor League honored Herb London in March of 2011 in New York City. The keynote address was given by Norman Sikoritz, and when I sent out the invitations, I got letters in the mail expressing their apologies for not being able to join us to honor Herb London from Vice President Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, Mitch Daniels, Alan West, and the list goes on. With that, Herb has recently moved on from just being a Harbor League Board of Trustee. He now is the chairman of the Harbor League in New York City. As we moved on, moving on to just from Maryland, but now we're in New York as well, amongst other places. And with that, let me introduce Herb.
Well, thank you very much, Ali. I'm going to sit here if that's okay with you. One of the most remarkable things in life is to be surpassed by your children. I was very recently speaking to a women's group in New Jersey with several hundred women present, and I was introduced in the following manner. Ladies and gentlemen, we have with us today a fine gentleman who happens to be the father of Stacey London. My name was never mentioned, which is rather interesting since I was giving the speech. Now, I'm here playing two roles tonight, which is a little unusual. I'm going to be a moderator, and I'm also replacing Andy McCarthy, who could not be with us tonight. Now, it's not easy being a replacement, but there's a little story that I'd like to tell you in the way of an introduction. This was a story involving a former president and governor in the United States named Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, when he was governor of New Jersey, was fast asleep one night when he received a call. His aide said, "This is a very alarming matter. Governor, I suspect that it's really rather important that you get to the telephone and speak to this gentleman as soon as possible." Well, it was 3 o'clock in the morning, and Wilson was quite upset about it. He gets on the phone, and this fellow says, "Governor, I want you to know that the Commissioner of Transportation passed away." Wilson said, "Well, please send my condolences to the family." This fellow said, no, Governor, I don't think you understand. I would like to replace him." Wilson, at this point, quite irritated, thought for a moment and said, "If it's okay with the undertaker, it's okay with me." So I'm in that replacement category. So I will speak at the end of this event and also at the beginning of this event. I have the great pleasure of introducing two friends, two people I greatly admire. On my right is Ken Timmerman. Many of you know Ken because he's written for the National Review, for the American Spectator, for a variety of publications. Most recently, he was associated with Newsmax. His articles are extraordinary. There's probably no one in the United States who has spoken to more people in Iran than Ken Timmerman. I believe that he is really, truly one of the great experts. Most significantly, he is also a congressional candidate from this state. So if you are thinking about someone to vote for, give this matter very serious consideration. And if you are thinking about making a political contribution, think about that as well. Now, I'm not going to engage any further in solicitations, but it's very important to remember Ken is running for office. On Ken's right is Jim Woolsey, who Jim needs no introduction. You will recall he was, of course, the head of the CIA during the Clinton years. didn't always have the opportunity to speak to the president, but he was an extraordinary, extraordinary CIA director. I wish that Clinton had listened to him a little more. Frankly, and one of the most interesting policy analysts that this country has produced is Jim Wilson. He has written a good deal as a journalist, as an author. He is a businessman. He's a man for all seasons. So it is a great pleasure to be in his country. The protocols this evening are the following. Each one of our speakers will talk for approximately 10 minutes. At the end of that 10-minute period, we'll engage in some sort of colloquy, a give and take. And then, of course, we'll open it up to you. And I'm sure this group is not shy. There'll be lots of questions. So we're going to start with Ken Timmerman.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Herb, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming out. There's so many friendly faces in this audience. It would be hard to name all of them, but I see Charles Lawler here, and of course, my wife, Christina. Christina, stand up just for a second. Come on. Christina's the joy of my life, and we've raised 5 children together, and it's been a remarkable adventure. We have been married, I just realized a couple of weeks ago, 25 years. It's just amazing how the time flies. But thank you all for being here tonight. I'd like to talk to you about a very serious issue, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran, the threat that the Islamic Republic poses to us here in the United States. And I'd also like to throw out for your consideration an alternative policy towards the Islamic Republic of Iran, because I believe that this administration and the people who are supporting them in Congress are taking us ineluctably to a war with Iran that we do not need and we can actually prevent. I think our military has been stretched over the past 10 years of war, foreign wars. Our military families have been stretched with 10 years of foreign wars. Our equipment is stretched. We do not need another war with Iran, especially if there are policies available to us that will allow us to defeat the enemy. What a lot of people forget in this country is that we have been at war with Iran since 1979. And I should be more precise. The Islamic Republic of Iran declared war on us on November 4th, 1979, when they took our diplomats hostage in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. We seem to believe the minute that Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president and the Ayatollah released our hostages in Tehran, we seem to believe at that moment the war was over. And for a number of years, it appeared like it might have been over. Iran got engaged in a deadly war with Saddam Hussein that dragged on from 1980 until 1988. But in the meantime, they were beavering away. They were hard at work trying to kill Americans and to kill Jews around the world. In 1983, in April, I was a relatively young correspondent in Beirut, sitting with Camille Chamoun, who at that time was a former president of the Lebanese Republic, interviewing him. It was a time of peace. It was a time of relative tranquility. We had U.S. Marines in Beirut at that time in a peacekeeping, a multinational peacekeeping force. And things were looking up for the first time after many, many years of a long civil war in Lebanon. And all of a sudden, there was a huge explosion that rattled the windows. And it was not right next door. It was a big explosion far away. And he said, oh, it's got to be the peacekeepers blowing up some of the unexploded ordnance, the mines that were left over from the war. I said, Your Excellency, I think it might be time for me to go. And if you don't mind, maybe we can pursue this conversation later on. And the ambulances, you could hear them already, the police sirens down the road. So I ran downstairs, jumped in the first cab I could get into, and I said, where to? And he said, oh, it's on the Corniche. And I said, you mean the embassy? He said, yeah, it's at the U.S. Embassy. So we rushed down there, and by the time I got there, the building was down. There were no firefighters or anything else. The whole front of this gigantic, 8-floor edifice had been ripped off, and wires were dangling, people were dangling, desks were dangling in midair. And out of the dust, because there was still dust from this explosion, emerges a young press secretary of the embassy, who I would later get to know a little bit, completely covered himself with dust. His face was white with dust from the explosion, and comes out to talk to perhaps a half dozen correspondents, including me, who were there. His name was Ryan Crocker. It was literally his test by fire as a young diplomat who went on to become, I believe, one of our most able diplomats, served both in Iraq and is currently in Afghanistan, Pakistan before that. But that attack in April of 1983 was carried out by the Islamic Republic of Iran. In October of the same year, they came again. And this time, they attacked our Marine barracks in Beirut. 241 Marines were murdered by the Iranian government. Now, we learned later on, many years later, and I've spent the past 7 years working on behalf of families of 9/11 victims as the lead investigator in a lawsuit against the Islamic Republic of Iran, trying to lay out evidence of their involvement with the Al-Qaeda hijackers. And ultimately, we presented our evidence to a New York court judge in December of last year, December of 2011. And this judge, George Daniels, had the reputation, I'm told by lawyers, I'm not a lawyer myself, but he had the reputation, I'm told, of being the slowest trial judge in America. He could sit on evidence for years. We presented our evidence orally in his courtroom on December 15th, 2011. And at the end of that 4-hour hearing, he issued a bench ruling right then and there in our favor and said, you have convinced me, the standard, your evidence has convinced me that the Iranian regime played a material role in aiding Al-Qaeda to attack us on 9/11. Now, one of the things we discovered in this investigation was that Iran was using, as a liaison to Al-Qaeda, a Lebanese terrorist named Imad Mubniyeh. In fact, Imad Mubniyeh became their top terrorist agent for many, many years. Well, I first encountered him in October of 1983, not personally, but came across his handiwork because he was the one who carried out the bombing of our Marines. He was the one who carried out the bombing of our Marines. And in our investigation, this is called the Havlish case, and for those of you who are writing down notes, you can find some of the documents at Iran911case.com, Iran911case.com, including a very long affidavit from me. He was the one who was sitting up on the hill outside of the airport in Beirut, videotaping the guy who drove the truck past our Marines and into the barracks. So Iran has a long history, a long war with America. We are the ones who do not seem to recognize that they've been at war with us. I believe we need to change our strategy. I believe we need to do that very quickly before Iran has nuclear weapons, before Iran uses nuclear weapons. I think we have a moral obligation to do everything we possibly can to help the people of Iran to overthrow the regime. Let me state that again, because it's a radical proposition in some circles. I believe that we need to help the people of Iran to change their own regime. Why? First of all, they're asking us for their assistance. There are 3 million Iranians on the streets of Tehran in June of 2009 begging for U.S. help. And we stayed silent. The President of the United States stayed silent. Worse, when he did finally open his mouth, he came out in support of the regime. In support of the regime instead of the people begging for their freedom. But I don't think we need to supply military assistance. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a whole series of measures, things that we can do as a nation using all of the tools of power diplomacy to enable the people of Iran to do what they want to do. But they do not right now have the means to do so. Let me just give you a couple of these. Number one, we cannot be legitimizing the regime by continuing to negotiate with them. Every time we negotiate with the regime in Tehran, they essentially are buying time. We did this in 2003 to 2005, and what did they do? They finished their enrichment plant at Natanz, and they said so. They said these foolish people in the West have given us enough time to build a new plant. If we go into another round of negotiations with the Iranian regime, they will complete their nuclear weapons program. So we need to delegitimize the regime in every possible instance. For example, at the United Nations, they belong to the Human Rights Council. Can you believe this? This is a regime that stones women. This is a regime that jails pastors because they have become Christians. They were Muslim background believers and they have become Christians, and the Iranian regime throws them in jail and is threatening to execute them. This is a regime that sells girls into slavery at the age of 13. They call it marriage to Mullahs. So they are on the UN Human Rights Council. We cannot go along with things like that. We have to help the people of Iran and the organizations inside Iran, which I have got to know over the past 15 years as the president of the Foundation for Democracy in Iran, where I've worked with some of the freedom fighters on the ground. We have to help them with secure communications equipment. In 1999, there were uprisings at 18 different cities, especially in the university communities. I happen to know some of the leaders of those uprisings, and they told me afterwards, they said, Kenneth, we had realized in Tehran that Tabriz was also rising up, that Isfahan was rising up, that Bandar Abbas and these other places were rising up. We could have coordinated our operations and we could have gotten rid of the regime then in 1999. So they need secure communications. Secure communications to be able to communicate back and forth without the regime being able to intercept. They need money. They need things to help them with a strike fund so workers can go out and go out into the streets and not having to worry about their families. We did this with Solidarity in Poland. We can do it with Iran. We need to help them with organizational skills. They don't know how to do a political organization, believe it or not. And there are many things that we can train them to do. This is a whole package of non-lethal assistance. If I'm elected to Congress, I will work very hard to make sure that this goes through and that we supervise how the money is spent, which is something that we don't do very well, to make sure we don't get more things as happened with the INC, the Iraqi National Congress. I think that we can do this very quickly. People say to me frequently, well, Ken, is there any time left to do this? Aren't they going to have nuclear weapons and possibly use nuclear weapons before, gosh, you help get the Iranian opposition organized? I said, look, we have a moral duty to try. Until the mushroom cloud goes off, we have a moral duty to try, because the alternative, my friends, the alternative is a regional war that could be a world war with a radical Islamic regime armed with nuclear weapons. And they are this far away from a nuclear weapons capability. They're not far at all. We know from the IAEA, for example, that they've tested all of the components. They've cold tested all of the components of a workable nuclear weapons design. We know that they have enough nuclear material to make 4 bombs today. The only thing that's lacking is the order from the Ayatollah to turn the screw and put it all together. And for all we know, he may have given that order, because we do not know what is in the bombs, and our intelligence is not very good. So my point to you, and what I'd like to leave with you and open this up to discussion, is that we have a moral duty to exhaust every possible means, short of war, to prevent this regime from going nuclear. And the best way to do it is by helping the people of Iran to get rid of the regime. We have time until the mushroom cloud goes off, and this is the one policy we have never tried. We have never tried this. We're doing sanctions. We're trying to change the behavior of the regime through economic pressure. Khomeini, right in the beginning, told us what that was all about. When you had the biggest sanctions regime ever imposed on them, their foreign assets were seized. They were shut out of the banking system when they had our hostages in 1979, 1980. And Khomeini turned to his aides and said, I'm not worried about these sanctions. The revolution is not about the price of weapons. They don't care about the economic pain that the Iranian people face. So yes, we've got to do sanctions. We should continue doing that, but we should have no illusions. The only effective policy, and the one thing we've never done, is to help the people of Iran get rid of the regime. Thank you.
You don't have to use the podium unless you care to.
I'm not a full lavalier.
Okay.
Well, wouldn't it be great to have a congressman like that? Let me say a few words about a major public policy issue that touches very heavily on the question of Iran, and that is, what do we do about our oil dependence? Iran is a leading member of OPEC, 12 countries, 2 in Latin America, 2 in Sub-Saharan Africa, 8 in the Middle East. It had the chairmanship until very recently, and they still have it. OPEC is a cartel, a conspiracy and restraint of trade. An organization that controls approximately 80% of the world's reserves of conventional oil, and if you add in the Canadian tar sands, 70%. So say 3/4. It is an institution that, particularly with respect to its 8 members in North Africa and the Middle East, is able to produce oil for a few dollars a barrel and then sell it for well over 100. Because its production costs are so low and its control is so great of the reserves in the world, it has the same kind of flexibility, really, that John D. Rockefeller had back at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, when he dominated the oil business effectively of the world, and certainly of the United States. He did it by turning the production facilities either up or down, depending on his tactical needs vis-a-vis his competitors. And he destroyed them one by one quite effectively, until he ran into Teddy Roosevelt and Roosevelt's notion of antitrust laws, and the Standard Oil Trust was effectively broken up. It took some years. But the notion of a cartel is not new. There are quotes from 3 rather talented economists, each one of which says that cartels are the greatest enemy of free economies, that where a government sees a cartel, its first job in order to maintain a free economy is to destroy that cartel. These 3 quotations, quite similar. One is from Adam Smith, one is from Friedrich Hayek, and one is from Milton Friedman. We have now, since oil dominates about 95% of the world's transportation fuels, and since OPEC dominates and controls over 3/4 of the world's oil, we have a cartel nested inside a monopoly. We are not addicted to oil, but our cars are. They can't drive on anything else, even though there are now, and increasingly so, different ways to propel ourselves around that do not require that subservience to oil. There's one country that is fortunate in its climate and land use, but does this, from my point of view, very well. Deals with this problem. It's Brazil. If you've been to Brazil recently and you drive into a filling station, you see 2 pumps, 2 sets of pumps. One for gasoline and one for what they call alcohol, which is essentially ethanol. Because ethanol is very cheap and easy to make in Brazil with the long growing season in the south and the land for sugarcane, it works just fine. Brazilian drivers choose what they want to drive on. If it's been a bad harvest year and ethanol is expensive, they pump gasoline. If gasoline's expensive, they pump ethanol. They decide. No government bureaucracy tells them. No big company tells them. They pick their transportation fuel. So one country in the world, I would say, really is energy independent. In the United States, however, the cartel that is OPEC and includes Iran and provides a major source of Iran's income to the tune of many tens of billions of dollars a year. That cartel controls things. And what are the consequences of that? Well, one set of consequences is that the United States borrows about $1 billion a day just to import foreign oil. That is approximately $1,000 a year for every American. We argue about taxes. We argue about tax relief. We talk about how big a deal it would be if $50 to $100 were added on or subtracted from our tax bills. What about $4,000 a year, taxes that a family of 4 in the United States pays? But you know, that tax is paid to a different government than the one in Washington or the one in Annapolis. It's paid in part to the Iranian government. It's not paid in such a way that it goes to fund our Social Security or the Naval Academy. It goes to fund the mullahs. And when you turn into a filling station and you, before you stop before a pump and get out, take out your billfold or your purse and find your credit card and charge your gasoline, think for just a minute. You know, there's terrorism going on all over the world. Some of it very heavily driven by Iran. Who is paying for them to be able to do that? Then what you need to do is, before you pump the gas, turn the rear view mirror just a couple of inches so you're looking into your own eyes. Now you know who is paying for that terrorism. You are looking at it, as am I. So if we want to do something about this, if we want to do something about Iran's relative wealth, even in the midst of the sanctions, to do something about its ability to do what it wants, which is to dominate the Middle East, if we want to do something about that, we have to break OPEC. We cannot do it otherwise. We cannot do it just by pumping oil ourselves. That's a good thing to do. It reduces our balance of payments. Instead of borrowing $1 billion a year, we might, $1 billion a day, we might only need to borrow $800 or $900 million a day. But that is not going to break OPEC. To break OPEC, we have to drive on something else. We have to be able to do what the Brazilians do. Has there been anything that has happened in the course of the last 20 or 30 years since in the early 1970s, we went through the oil crisis and we've lived with this mess called oil dependence for those 40 years. Has anything new happened? Everybody seems agitated about this problem from time to time, and nobody seems to be able to do anything about it. Let me tell you, something has happened. The creation of hydrofracturing to produce natural gas, yes, it has to be done in an environmentally sound manner, but I think it's clear that that is possible. The hydrofracturing, blasting water and sand down into natural gas shale, to radically increase the production and the affordable production of natural gas, has changed something that is absolutely fundamental. Up until the last 2, 3, 4 years, natural gas and oil followed one in terms of energy content per dollar. Followed another along very closely, because oil and gas were produced together. And so if gas was, say, $2 per million BTUs, rule of thumb was multiplied by 6 to get to the number of barrels of oil. That was the equivalent in energy terms of about $12 a barrel of oil. If natural gas was $3 per million BTUs, oil would be about $18 a barrel. They track one another along. Well, we're driving on gasoline, so it doesn't seem to make much sense, even though you can drive on alcohol fuels, such as methanol with an M, derived from natural gas. You could do it very easily. It's just that the energy cost about the same, so there wasn't any real point in bothering to go through the change. Hydrofracturing and OPEC's thirst for money have changed that. Oil is now, on an equal energy basis, an order of magnitude more expensive than natural gas. It's about $120 a barrel for Brent crude, whereas natural gas is only $2 per million BTUs, which would be the equivalent of $12 oil. Instead of $12, oil is $120. It is 10 times more expensive than natural gas. What does that say to you? That the possibility of deriving fuels from natural gas and driving on them may, relatively speaking, be a devil of a lot cheaper than it has been for a long time. And in fact, the numbers in MIT, recent MIT studies and all the rest, say this is a no-brainer. It is very easy to produce methanol with an M from natural gas. We've had industries doing that for years. It's done all over the world. It's the way you make natural gas these days. You can make it from coal too, but natural gas is simple. And that means that it can be, with today's gasoline prices, probably about 40 to 50% cheaper on a per mile basis than gasoline. And as oil climbs and we get up past $4 a gallon for gasoline to $5 and $6 and $7 and even European levels of, my God, $10 a gallon of gasoline, methanol from natural gas will be an increasingly small share of the price of gasoline from oil. So, can we do this? It's as difficult as putting in an extra pump at a filling station. Yes, people are going to have to increase the size of the methanol business in the United States, but that's easy to do. We know how to do this. It's building relatively small, simple chemical plants. What would happen? You would become as smart and shrewd and full of self-control and as able to influence your country's destiny as the Brazilians. Americans would finally be able to do what Brazilians can do and do every day, which is drive into a filling station, look at the pumps and say, what do I want to buy? I want to buy gasoline? Do I want to buy ethanol because it's probably going to be there anyway, or do I want to buy methanol? Let's see, the prices. I think I'll buy methanol today. Up to you. No mandates, no taxes, no tariffs, no directives. Up to you. Who would hate that the most? OPEC. And who is the most aggressive member of OPEC that uses its resources to work every day as hard as it possibly can to dominate the Middle East? That would be Iran. Thank you.
Well, I had the unenviable role of being a cleanup hitter. It seems to me there are a couple of lessons that I've learned from my two colleagues. First, look at that side view mirror in your car very carefully the next time you're in a gas station. Well, let's break OPEC if we can. And secondly, let's significantly think about the whole idea of some sort of regime change in Iran. But let me provide a somewhat different perspective, and that is the incentives and disincentives from the point of view of Iran. From the Iranian point of view, nuclear weapons are more than simply a military weapon. They're a political weapon. A political weapon that takes advantage of the imperial impulse that exists in Iran. Roughly a year and a half ago, I had the opportunity to sit down with the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Iran. And I said to him, well, I understand your desire for the Shia Crescent. He looked at me and said, Shia Crescent? We want the full moon. He was very much interested in the development of nuclear weapons to influence events in the Middle East. When I mentioned this to someone in Foggy Bottom, he said to me, well, this is a Shia country. Obviously, there will be some sort of opposition from the Sunnis. And needless to say, there have been some contentions, obviously obvious contentiousness between the Sunni and the Shia. But I'm reminded of another story that was originally told to me in Russian, but has, I think, direct application to this analysis. Two cab drivers are on a one-way highway. and they're facing one another. And they come to an impasse. One cab driver says to the other, "You move." The other cab driver says, "No, no, you move." One cab driver becomes so angry, so animated, he gets out of his cab, he goes over to the other cab, fists bristling, and he sees that there's a Jew sitting in the back seat, and he beats up the Jew. The other cab driver says, "Well, I'll show you." He goes to the other cab, and sure enough, in the back seat of that cab is another Jew, and he beats up that Jew. Now, what is the moral of this story? One cab driver is Shia, one cab driver is Sunni. They hate one another, but in fact, they hate the Jews more.
That's right.
Now, the fact is, not only do they hate the Jews more, you could use the great Satan or Americans in the back seat of that car and tell the same story. And so what you have is, despite the obvious differences that exist between Shia and Sunni, the notion that they would balance one another is something of great fiction that exists in Plagni Bottom. The other part of the story that I think is important to note, and Ken, I think, made reference to this, we've been at war with Iran for a considerable period. Now, there's a good deal of distrust in the Arab world for the Persians in Iran. But despite that distrust, there is more fear about an Iran with nuclear weapons. Now, consider the fact that this, in some respects, is a backward regime, but it has an educated population. So there is an opportunity for regime change. The one thing that Ken didn't say, but was implied in his remarks, is that if we had a CIA that wasn't defanged, obviously there's more that could be done within Iran, and probably should be done. Now, there's an awful lot that is going on at the moment. The Israelis are thinking very seriously about the military option, and they have to. After all, the existential fate of Israel lies in the hands of what Iran may or may not do. If you rely on the public comments that have been made by Ahmadinejad, it is very clear that they would love to wipe Israel off the map in a way that would solidify the Arab ambitions in that part of the world. Israel cannot tolerate this situation. The logistics associated with attacking Iran are complicated. I just came back from Israel where I spent a good deal of time chatting with military leaders about this. And while that obviously not going to be very much revealed, there are contingency plans. And those contingency plans include the possibility that we would destroy or attempt to destroy some of the nuclear facilities. But keep in mind, even if that occurred, and we're talking about an air model, very significant proportions, the fact of the matter is that it would give you another 2-year window, maybe a 3-year window, but probably no more than that. And there would be a very significant period of disharmony, not only in the Middle East, but around the world, as a result, as the aftermath of that kind of attack. So there are all kinds of calculations that take place. But as Senator McCain, I said very appropriately, in my opinion, the only thing worse than attacking Iran is an Iran with nuclear weapons. So the world cannot tolerate it. The question is, how do we deal with it? Now, this administration is very much devoted to sanctions. And I believe that sanctions are necessary. However, very recently I read in the Wall Street Journal, just several days ago, about the exemptions in the sanctions policy. And there was Germany, France, Switzerland, the very nations that can provide the kind of technical hardware that the Iranians need. So what do we mean by sanctions? How serious are we about sanctions? Now keep in mind that there's an awful lot that's happening to the European economy. They're desperate at the moment. So if you get a nice rate of return in this kind of trade with Iran, obviously there are incentives for moving ahead in that direction. So one wonders about the policies that would be put in place that would create enough of a disincentive for Iran to give up its nuclear weapons. And as I've suggested right from the outset, if one considers the imperial ambitions of this administration in Iran, there is more to be gained by having nuclear weapons than not having nuclear weapons. Which brings me back to the military option. I don't think that it can be denied. I don't think it could be ignored. I don't think that we can simply say we do not want to use it. At some point, if we do not, the Israelis may be obliged to do so on their own. And if that does happen, I assure you that there will be many in the world who would say the United States was complicit anyway, even if this is denied by President Obama. Well, I think it's an interesting and extraordinary moment that we face, and a very dangerous moment that we face. Will we in the United States consider that military option seriously? Will we engage in the kind of change within Iran, the kind of regime change that Ken quite eloquently made reference to? Will we break the OPEC domination over oil in the world? Curious questions that we have to address as a people. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to give my colleagues an opportunity for them to raise some questions that they haven't raised yet, or perhaps to ask questions to one another. Ken, you want to say something?
One thing we did not talk about yet, and I'll talk about just briefly now, is the immediate military threat that we face in this country, in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Ellie asked us in the outset, why should we care here in Baltimore? Well, we care clearly because we're filling up our tank with gas and funding terrorism. That's a very good reason to care about what's happening in the Middle East. But here's another reason. The Iranian regime has been actively working for the past 20 years to develop an electromagnetic pulse weapon. An EMP weapon is a form of a nuclear weapon which would be exploded at 200 miles above us in the atmosphere. We would not necessarily even see anything. We certainly would not have mass casualties on the ground. There would be nobody who died immediately from the attack. But you would go outside in the morning, if it happened at night, and go to turn your car on to go to work. You'd turn the key and nothing would happen. You'd go back inside to pick up the phone to call somebody and ask what was going on. The phone would be dead. You'd flip on your light switch, the lights wouldn't go on. A week later, the food would be rotten in your refrigerator. You'd go into the Safeway or to the Giant to try to stock up. There'd be no food left. It would take down, an EMP strike would take down our national power grid in an instant. And it's something that the Iranians have told us that they are working on. They have written in their military journals about the desirability of asymmetrical warfare, in particular using an EMP strike against us. They have tested a ballistic missile in an EMP mode, in other words, exploding it up at apogee in the atmosphere and calling that test a success. We, in our great wisdom in the intelligence community of this country, considered it a failure. The Iranians considered it a success for a very good reason, because that's exactly what they wanted to do. They wanted to make sure that they had the fusing right to be able to make the warhead go off up in the atmosphere. They have also tested, and this quite some time ago, in 1998, putting an older generation missile launcher, the Scud, on a barge in the Caspian Sea. Why is that significant? Because they don't need to have an ICBM to attack us with an EMP weapon. They can put an old generation, tried and true Scud missile or something similar on a container ship, and they can drive it up someplace up and down the east coast or the west coast in commercial shipping lanes. Nobody would ever see it. Hundreds of other ships out there on the ocean, 100 miles or 150 miles off of our coasts. And in the dead of night, they can bring the missile launcher up from the hole and fire that missile up over our atmosphere and explode a nuclear weapon in an EMP trajectory. We would never see it coming. We have no defenses that are deployed with our Aegis class cruisers and destroyers now to be able to intercept it. It would take about, I think, something like 3 minutes, Jim, 3 or 4 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, or to get to the point over Kansas, which would be optimal to take down the entire national power grid. And here's the kicker of all this. The Electromagnetic Pulse Commission, the EMP Commission, which was created thanks to Roscoe Bartlett, who's one of my heroes in Congress for having understood way ahead of his time the type of threat that we faced from regimes such as Iran, who would like to see us wiped off the map. The EMP Commission concluded in 2 of their public reports that a strike of this nature on America would take us back to the population that we had in about 1880. They said specifically, we would no longer be able to sustain the population that we have today, 310 million people. We would go back to a nation of about 80 to 90 million people. Within a year, America would be reduced to 80 to 90 people. You're talking about mass murder. But it doesn't happen immediately from a military strike. It happens over the period of weeks and months as people starve. The inner cities erupt into riots, and people can eat whatever they can hunt, fish, steal, and walk back to some place to cook it or just to eat it raw. We will go back to barbarism, my friends, to barbarism if this happens. And by the way, we have a very simple response, which Congress, for whatever reason, has refused to take. It would cost us about $1 billion through our electricity bills to shield the 700 very large transformers in this country to keep the power grid up and running. There have been two pieces of legislation. One is called the SHIELD Act, and one's called the GRID Act, introduced in 2 successive years. They passed the House, but the Senate would not consider them. Why is absolutely beyond me. I was at a presentation with Cynthia Ayers, who I see is here in the audience. Thank you, Cynthia, for being here. In New York, with Peter Husey and others, and Jim, you were at that one, weren't you, in New York? And it was proposed that the $1 billion that it would cost to protect us from an EMP strike amounts to about $3 per family one time. Just think of that. $3 per family one time as an insurance policy against the end of the world.
It's a venti latte.
Exactly. So as Peter Husey said at that meeting, he said, I'll take 5.
Jim, just to add a point or two. Ken's right about this EMP threat. It's a terrible problem. The weapon does not have to be sophisticated. The basic nuclear weapon would do the job just fine. The more sophisticated it is, the more area it could probably cover. But one thing people think about is, well, of course we've got ballistic missile defense, right? Well, 2 things. First of all, the Obama administration has cut back on the ballistic missile program, defense program, in order to make the Russians happy. And it is less effective against a launch coming out of Iran than it would have been in its earlier mode. But even more importantly, we have no ballistic missile defense that can shoot anything down in the so-called ascent phase while it's going up before it starts coming down. All of our ballistic missile defense is designed to shoot something after it's gotten to mid-course, or even when it's in terminal phase, just before it hits the target on the ground, because they weren't dealing with trying to deal with something that would detonate on the way up or when it's at the top of its trajectory. They were thinking about traditional military targets for a ballistic missile. So Ken's right. We have 18 critical infrastructures in the country: water, food, sewage, etc. All 17 of the others depend on the electric grid. So if the grid goes in a fashion like this, not just for a day or 2 or 3 or 4 where your diesel generator will be fine probably, but if the grid goes out over a substantial period of time, you are not back in the 1970s pre-web. You're back in the 1870s pre-electric grid, and none of this has enough pump handles or plow horses.
I'm going to, on that very upbeat note, give you an opportunity to ask some questions. Now, let me just urge you, this is an audience that's very sophisticated, but please ask a question. Don't deliver a speech. Yes, sir, we're going to start with you in the back.
I'd just like to expand on the EMP for a second. Doesn't it also go beyond that to where it affects our electronic gear? What I heard that it knocks our computer systems out. It's not just the grid we're worried about. We suddenly don't have any of our electronic devices that work anymore. Our cars might not work, anything else like that. We end up not only being to an 1880s population, but perhaps an 1880s sophistication for technology.
It affects all electronics. It affects different types of electronics to a different degree depending on how big the blast is and how far away it was. And so it's a bit complicated, but it's not just the grid it affects. You're right.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. You alluded to Khomeini. How about he's an older man now? How about Rafsanjani? I haven't heard you mention him, and where the Iranian money is. Canada, quite a bit. So would you elaborate a little bit?
Well, I mean, Rafsanjani's position is not so different from Khomeini. What you've seen is that he's sometimes described in American journals as the moderator. Well, this is absurd. His position is precisely the same as Ahmadinejad and everyone else. And of course, as we don't know exactly how decisions are made in Iran, but there's no question that a group of imams are very much involved in those decisions. And it's also correct, I think, your assertion that Iranian money exists elsewhere is true. There's no question the Iranians have invested very significantly in Europe, and they've invested significantly in Asia as well. So that Iranian money has indeed had some political influence around the globe.
Iranian moderate, Rafsanjani is a moderate in the same way that the mainstream media decided back in the 1980s that when a drop-off the KGB head became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, they reported that he drank scotch and liked to listen to jazz, and therefore he was a moderate. The people who actually knew him say he did not like scotch and he did not like jazz, but it was the party line.
Let me just add two things to that, if I may. In my book, Countdown to Crisis, The Coming Nuclear Showdown with Iran, which was published now 7 years ago, there's a quote from Rafsanjani where he is asked, is it possible, Mr. President, this is when he was president, that there might be a nuclear weapons exchange with the state of Israel? And he said, oh yes, it's possible. And if such a thing happened, millions would die in the Dar al-Islam, in the land of Islam. But that's okay, because Israel would cease to exist. That's a moderate in Iranian context.
John?
I wonder if you could comment on, when you talk about nuclear weapons and the administration is focusing on the weapons capability, what about a nuclear device like the Hiroshima bomb, which does not require any of those sophisticated tests, which if put in a shipping container or in a truck, and this is what we were supposed to be worried about after 9/11, were to detonate an American city, and because Iran had never tested a device, we would have no forensics to figure out where it came from.
John, you're right. We tested a simple, highly enriched uranium device, so-called shotgun device, with a very simple firing mechanism. You blast a load of highly enriched uranium down into a pocket that's highly enriched uranium, and when the two come together, you have a nuclear event. We used a bomb designed that way with highly enriched uranium in combat in the biggest war we ever fought, World War II, without one ever having been tested in the history of the world. What we tested at Alamogordo was a plutonium weapon that's spherical and somewhat sophisticated and has to be detonated just right, and has a better yield-to-weight ratio and so forth. But if you're talking just a really simple, blunt, and ugly nuclear device, something you could put in the hold of the ship or whatever, have it pull into a harbor and go boom and have a mushroom cloud and radioactivity and a nuclear event. Yes, you can do that with something that is a lot simpler. And this is the kind of device that Iran already has enough low-enriched uranium for 4 of these, and can, the process of making it highly enriched is just a continuation of the enrichment process with centrifuges and the rest that you use to make it low enriched. So it's a very difficult problem to deal with, especially if you keep getting distracted, as every president since Jimmy Carter, except for Jerry Ford, has been. The Persians invented chess, and they're good at it, and they've been since 1979 moving one piece, one pawn down one side of the board to get to the king's row and convert to the lethal nuclear queen. In the meantime, on the other side of the board, they're going through various operations like let's negotiate and so forth in order to distract us, and they've done it successfully now for a third of a century.
Yes, sir.
You've mentioned using methanol derived from natural gas. The administration and the industry seems to be pushing lithium-ion batteries. Where does lithium come from?
Lithium comes from more places than some of the early stories said. There is a lot in Bolivia, but it's not in a form that's relatively easily used. There's a good deal in Chile, I think, and some in Peru. There's a great deal in China. There's a fair amount in the United States. It's just that the lithium mines got closed down for environmental reasons, and one of them is in the process of being reopened. And the reasons lithium is important is it's probably one of the major ingredients in a battery for electric vehicles. Now, I'm not opposed to electric vehicles. I have two of them. I've got a Chevy Volt, and I've got a Prius that's had a battery added, and I like being able to drive 25 to 40 miles a day on 2 cents a mile electricity and not using a drop of gasoline until I get past that first 30 or 40 miles. I think that's all fine. It's just that you're going to see a relatively slow introduction of electric vehicles into the American fleet because the batteries are expensive, the cars are a bit expensive, and it's just going to take time to get there. The interesting thing about methanol is that you can use it in today's vehicles with a bit of reprogramming of the software and a 41-cent O-ring. You don't have to have a multi-thousand-dollar battery. You don't have to have a multi-thousand-dollar conversion of your car to drive on natural gas. So it's a 41-cent O-ring and some software. So the ability to change and do something like that relatively quickly is what's of special interest. And finally, I get, according to the calculation on my Volt, I get about 92 miles per gallon because I'm driving sometimes on electricity, and then when I'm using liquid fuel after that first 40 miles, it's gasoline. If that liquid fuel I was using was M85, methanol, 85% methanol and 15% gasoline, I would be getting about 450 miles per gallon of gasoline because I'm driving on electricity for 30 or 40 miles, and then after that I'm driving on methanol, 85% methanol. So it's not incompatible to go to alternative non-gasoline fuels at the same time you're putting into the market the ability to drive electrically. They both move you away from gasoline consumption, gasoline made from petroleum, and that, to me, is the key thing.
Of course, that Chevy Volt really cost $300,000 when you factor in all the taxpayers.
Oh, yes, sir, you're standing, go ahead.
Yeah, if it's only $1 billion to cover every unit in the United States for power, couldn't individual power companies decide to do it on their own rather than waiting for the government to do it?
It's the major transformers that you can do that with. Not, you'd need to do, it'd be more costly to do everything, but the major transformers are the things that it's hardest to replace. It takes the most time, 2 or 3 years standing in line in South Korea or Germany in order to get these huge, extremely high voltage transformers. I think it's important that the whole electromagnetic pulse business be dealt with in the context of that there is in fact a problem on this issue from the sun as well. About once a century, give or take a decade or 2 or 3, there's a major solar event that has a lot in common with an electromagnetic pulse. It's not all solar events. We had one here a couple of weeks ago. But there's a really big one, historically, about every century or so. It's been a century and a half since we've had one of these. So one thing we can do is explain to our friends who are wince so much when they hear about things like electromagnetic pulse and they don't think anybody could be that evil or that bad and we don't really have to worry about it, do we? We can say, look, set aside the Iranians. Just look at the sun. Look at the history of this. These pulses exist and they're produced just as a simple matter of prudence. We ought to be doing this. This sort of thing was fought tooth and nail by the utilities when it came up in the Congress the 2 times. You asked who defeated it, the utilities defeated it. They don't like worrying about these problems. They don't like thinking about them. They don't like saying anything about them because their lawyers say, if people know you're talking about this and something bad happens, they're going to sue you and say that you're liable for not fixing it. So if you're looking for fixes, you've got to find some way through presidential leadership or some other way to get the utilities to take these problems like EMP seriously. Today, they do not.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm old enough to remember the Cold War in its early stages and the importance of distinguishing between an adversary's capabilities and its intentions. There was a notable book by Vannevar Bush published just after the last war called Modern Arms and Free Men that had all kinds of blood-curdling scenarios in it about chemical, bacteriological warfare, which you haven't mentioned, let alone nuclear, and the others are potentially just as devastating. But his response, and I think it's a correct one, is that deterrence is usually the answer to most of these problems. I can remember growing up with our more hysterical politicians like Nelson Rockefeller and Jack Kennedy, who wanted a huge program under which every homeowner would build a huge shelter in his backyard. And it's a good way of bankrupting the country if you analyze foreign governments only on the basis of what they may be capable of rather than what they are likely to do. And what we haven't heard much about this evening is what are the real intentions. I'm not talking about Ahmadinejad's snatches of rhetoric. There were plenty of those in the Russian propaganda machine also. What are the real estimates?
It's a good
Thanks,
question.
sir. It's a very good question. And let me start by suggesting to you that I have had a long history with a colleague who's the founder of the Hudson Institute named Herman Kahn, who was caricatured by Stanley Kubrick in a film called Dr. Strangelove. Now, Herman spent a good deal of his early professional life dealing with the whole question of deterrence. And in two very important books, On Thermonuclear War, and the second was Thinking the Unthinkable, he made the point that deterrence can work if, in fact, you can hold the civilian population of your enemy hostage, as we were held hostage, with MAD, mutually assured destruction. But if you're dealing with a theological question, very different from anything we've encountered before, where people will say, well, we lose 20 million people in Iran. Doesn't make any difference. After all, we're waiting for the imam to return to earth. Now, I don't know if this rhetoric is real or not, just as I didn't know or could not possibly have known what Hitler had in mind when he wrote Mein Kampf. But he was serious. The problem is you don't know how serious the enemy really is. And my feeling is you do not have the luxury of assuming that he's not serious. You have to take these matters very seriously. So if, in fact, he's willing to lose 20 million people in Iran and a population of roughly 70 million people, that's a lot of people to lose, and in fact, he may believe that from a theological standpoint, it makes sense. The great conflagration has to occur before the imam returns to earth. So the issue of deterrence is a bit trickier than it was during the Cold War. It's a little more complicated than the Cold War.
It definitely is. But Bernard,
You had the
let
same
us,
arguments about China, though, when
well,
China was developed.
but not reasonably. Bernard Lewis, I think our greatest authority on this part of the world, says that mutual assured destruction was a deterrent to war. The problem is that with the leadership of Iran, mutual assured destruction is an inducement, not a deterrent.
Exactly.
That's from our leading scholar of this part of the world. Now, why would he say that? Well, first of all, I've negotiated with the Soviets 4 times over arms control agreements. And I got to know some of them reasonably well. I would say that by the 1960s, their ideology was essentially dead. They were a bunch of thugs with a cover story called Marxism-Leninism. There were, by the mid to late 60s, at least in my view, more true-believing revolutionary Marxist-Leninists in the bookstores of the Upper West Side of Manhattan than there were in the Kremlin. those guys didn't want to die for the principle, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. They wanted to remodel their Dodges. And when I really kind of miss the Soviets, to tell you the truth. I'd love to trade the Iranians in for them. The Soviets were kind of an ideal enemy for us. They were thugs with a cover story. They had an absolutely lousy economy, which we somehow didn't understand, most of us at the time. And we contained them and we deterred them, and it worked the way Kennan and Nitze said it would in the 1940s, and their lousy economy collapsed and we won the Cold War. They were an ideal opponent. I wish to God we had them back and could trade them for Ahmadinejad and his life. Ahmadinejad and the circle around him are close to an Ayatollah named Mesbah Yazdi. Mesbah Yazdi is the head of a group called the Hojatiya, which Ahmadinejad sends a lot of the leadership of the Revolutionary Guard down to be schooled at the Hojatiya school run by Mesbah Yazdi down near the holy city of Qom. Mesbah Yazdi, when he was a young Ayatollah, was exiled to that school by Khomeini. Why? Because Khomeini thought he was too radical. This is Ahmadinejad's mentor. This is the man who hosts him when he goes down to Qom to stand at the well where the hidden imam disappeared as a little boy in the 10th century and talks to the hidden imam. That is where the road goes from to get to central Tehran, which Ahmadinejad has built. So when the Mahdi comes back and is getting ready for the wars that will end the world, the Mahdi will have a nice road to ride on in triumph to Tehran. Look, the United States has a very, very self-deceptive view about people like the Iranian leadership. We say they're not crazy, and they're not in the sense of being raging lunatics. But there are not two categories of human beings in this world, there are more. And one category, in addition to raving lunatics and just sort of normal people, even if they're mean normal like the Soviets, or nice normal like us. But a third category are sociopaths. Hitler was a sociopath. They can be extremely shrewd, extremely careful, extremely rational, in pursuit of an objective to kill all the Jews and dominate Europe for 1,000 years. Or to operate in such a way that you kill all the Jews, paving the way for the Mahdi to come back and have the wars to end life. Now, what share of Ahmadinejad's immediate followers believe that? I don't know. I know it's an important current in Iranian theological belief. Most all Iranian Shia are 12ers, which means they're waiting for the 12th Imam to come back, but for most of them it probably doesn't have a lot more impact on their daily lives than a Christian belief that Jesus will return or a Jewish belief that the Messiah will come. It's a belief, but for a subset, it's not just a belief, it is, as Bernard Lewis puts it, it is an inducement. And I think it is very, very self-centered of us to think that the world consists entirely of either rational people or people who are stark raving nuts. And this category of the shrewd, calculating, rational sociopath, the Hitlers and I believe the Ahmadinejads, is a group that we really have to think about, because sometimes they get control of something important. Castro is like that as far as I'm concerned. We now know from the Russian materials that were turned loose after the Cold War that Castro did everything he possibly could during the Cuban Missile Crisis to get a nuclear war going. We owe a great deal to the sensible Soviet naval officers who said, But even though it would have destroyed Cuba, and it would have caused such damage to the United States, and Castro was not even a religious fanatic, he's just a fanatic. Castro strongly believed and strongly worked for nuclear war in 1962.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, for one thing, a couple of questions. Ken, isn't Rafsanjani a communist? And as you may have heard me mention before, you don't have to accept this thesis. I believe that the Iranians and the Muslim radicals are a cutout for continued Soviet aggression against us because, in fact, they get all of their supplies, all of their training, all their intel, etc., from the Soviets, from the Russians, if you want to call them that. But you don't even have to agree with that thesis to acknowledge that the Russians have the Iranians and most of those Middle Eastern terror groups under their thumb because they really call the shots there. And so I wonder how much independent latitude any of those groups have on their own. I don't think the Iranians would do anything like that without the Russians' permission. And I also, by the same token, I don't think that a homegrown revolution in Iran would be allowed to be successful because the Russians have such a vested interest in maintaining control there. I'll take the comments.
Well, first of all, Rafsanjani's not a communist. He's probably the wealthiest man in Iran today. He's made his fortune by ripping off everybody else. He began as a pistachio farmer in the eastern parts of Iran, and after that he's been placing his children in a perfect mafiosi fashion in every large portion of every large industry related to the oil and gas industry in Iran. So he's very much into money. He's built a large personal fortune, and he's proud of that. And he sent one of his sons, Mehdi, to live in London as the unrest grew following the stolen elections in June of 2009 with the keys to the fortune. And he was clearly looking for his personal survival after the wars began, should those wars begin. The Iran-Russia relationship, however, Jim, you're very right to point to, it is a very close relationship. The KGB trained the Iranian intelligence service after the 1979 revolution. And by the way, let's not forget that one of the men involved in creating the Iranian intelligence service, MOIS, was Mir Hussein Mousavi, the man considered the head of the Green Movement and the new reformist, the new smiling face to the regime in June of 2009. I was a bit skeptical about that when it occurred. Today, the Russians have worked hand in glove with the Iranians to help them develop long-range ballistic missile capabilities. If you remember, in 1995, when Yeltsin was president of Russia, they had signed a nuclear cooperation agreement between Iran and Russia. Bill Clinton, in one of the rare good things that he did during his presidency, in May of 1995, went for his summit with Boris Yeltsin and got Yeltsin to back off in public from what he called, in public, the military aspects of that nuclear cooperation agreement between Russia and Iran. Now just think of that. What can possibly be the military aspects of a nuclear cooperation agreement? You're talking about nuclear weapons. So the Russians already then, were thinking about helping Iran to acquire a nuclear weapons capability. And what they actually backed off from in 1995 was building an underground test site and delivering to Iran a full-up turnkey uranium enrichment plant.
Go ahead, Kelly.
We have time for one more question. I want to ask my hero, Ellen Sauerbright.
Thank you. I can't stand up because...
Oh, that's okay. You've got the final question.
I'm semi-crippled right now. Herb, you mentioned that we should not take a military option off the table. I wanted to get your thoughts about the realistic possibilities, even today, of the U.S. being able to conduct a military option, considering the state of our debt, our economy, our reliance on China, how thin our military is spread
could we even engage in a military option without destroying?
But this would require an air armada over the course of a week or maybe 2 weeks. Yes, we could do it. I mean, there's no question that we've hollowed out the military. We've cut the defense budget significantly. The committee that was organized, the bipartisan committee that was organized, was really a setup because the president said right from the outset, if you cannot engage in an agreement, we're going to cut the military budget in a very significant way. And knowing that this was a Republican and Democratic-led organization, there was no way in which you could get a meeting of the minds. However, I do believe that said, the United States, if it was put in a position where we had to engage in this kind of military activity, I think we could do so. I don't think we have the ability to engage in a sustained attack over a long period of time, and neither do the Israelis. And as I indicated to you before, what does success mean in this case? Probably setting back the Iranian program a year or 2 or maybe 3, but certainly no more than that. And so that doesn't mean that we've eliminated the possibility that Iran will have or secure a nuclear weapons program in the future. It does mean that we've set the program back, and maybe we can put in place the kind of regime change that Ken was talking about before.
I think it's a real mistake to equate use of military force, if we have to do it, with just an attack on the Iranian nuclear program. The Revolutionary Guard not only runs the nuclear program for Iran, it runs the ballistic missile program, it runs the space program, it runs the Al-Quds force, which it uses to intervene in nearby countries. It runs the Basiji, the thugs, the kind of brown shirts in the streets that beat up, kill, and rape the key people who are out demonstrating. It controls several industries. It is kind of a combination of the SA, the SS, the Gestapo, and in the mode almost People's Liberation Army of China was in a few years ago when they controlled quite a few industrial enterprises. So the Revolutionary Guard is not only a very, at the heart of the power of the regime, it is the principal instrument of repressing the Iranian people. And I think certainly we could do this. I think that, and have the resources, I think that is not a problem right now. It could be a problem given what the president is doing with the budget before too long is gone. But today or 6 months from now, I think we could do something like the following. I've written this with Bud McFarland and National Review Online. I think we send about 5 carrier battle groups to the Indian Ocean. I think we send the B-1s and B-2s and a certain number of the B-52s to Diego Garcia, assuming the Brits will go along. If not, send them to Wake and Guam. I think we load them up with all sorts of earth-penetrating and especially destructive and extremely accurate weapons. And in the first instance, I would pull a Teddy Roosevelt here and let that big stick just sit there and speak very softly, or perhaps not speak at all. But let the Iranians know in one way or another that everything tied to the Revolutionary Guard is what we would destroy. And if we have to use force, to use it that way, to destroy their training camps, to go after the residences of their senior people, and we know where some of these are, to go after everything about the Revolutionary Guard, not take down the electric grid of the Iranian people, not even necessarily target their regular army, which is not particularly a problem, and is actually the reason they rely so much on the Revolutionary Guard is they're worried about the allegiance of the army. So any instrumentality of the government that could do something like block the Strait of Hormuz, little speedboats and so forth, but generally speaking, it would be everything related to the Revolutionary Guard. And believe me, if they set off a nuclear weapon or otherwise did something that gave us an excuse to use that force, and a president, whether this one or an next one, used it, this would be something that the totalitarian rulers of Iran, I think would not come back from real quickly.
Let me add one word about the super committee and the military budgets element, because you did refer to that quite openly. If the sequester, what's called the sequester, goes into effect, which and it looks now as if it will go into effect, we will have $1 trillion of defense cuts over the next 10 years. When we project those budgets out to 2020, and you look at what we know today about the Chinese military budget and what is not on their budget, Communist China will be spending more than we will in 2020 on military hardware. Communist China in 2020 will have a bigger defense budget than we will in 2020 if we keep on going in the direction that Obama wants us to go. The person on the super committee who failed to come to any compromise was Chris Van Hollen. This is the man that I'm running against. And I think for no other reason, his failed leadership on the super committee is the reason we should fire him.
Let me bring this to a conclusion. Let me thank Jim for your remarkable remarks, and Ken as well. Let me urge you to provide as much support to Ken as possible in this coming congressional race. In 1937, though, with war clouds on the horizon, George Orwell said that the first duty of intelligent people is the restatement of the obvious. There's a lot that's been stated today that's obvious, some not so obvious. But the one thing that we as an American people have to consider are the dangers that we face and the way in which we'll oppose them. Thank you very much for coming this evening. Let me thank Ellie and the members of the Harbor League for making this possible.
I thank all our panelists and panelists/moderator for coming, Herb, as Ken and Jim Wolsey. I just wanted to make one last announcement, and that is that contrary to what was said on the stage, the Harbor League is a 501c3 and we do not endorse any candidate. However, when putting together a panel on Iran, and especially in Maryland where we don't have to pay for transportation costs, Ken Timmerman was the guy to have. I mean, nobody knows more, as indicated before, nobody knows more about Iran than Ken Timmerman. I'll make the director of CIA, but other than that, nobody else.
When I made comments about Ken, by the way, I was not referring to the Harbor League. I was merely referring to my own personal sentiments.
But that being said, the beauty of that is that your contributions to the Harbor League are tax deductible. So, in addition,
You didn't invite Chris Van Hollen.
well, maybe after a primary, we can then have the Harbor League can host a debate. But other than that, we don't endorse any candidates, but we do accept contributions. Have a very good night, and thank you very much for joining us.